And Jordan McKenzie is presenting Mass Emotional Events, Rethinking Emotional Contagions After COVID-19. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm presenting today on a chapter that I wrote with Roger Patulny, Rebecca Olson, and Molly Bauer. It's in a book that I've just edited with Roger Patulny. I promise that's the only plug, but that is my very, very short plug. The book is Dystopian Emotions. It'll be out in December through Bristol. So what are we talking about today? I want to start by kind of going back in time a little bit and reminding everyone, I guess, of this kind of strange phenomenon that happened in early 2000, in January 2000, in Hawaii, when everybody on the island was sent out this text message. Basically, someone pressed the wrong button, as some of you might remember from the news. I don't know how much people remember this story, but for roughly 38 minutes, people in Hawaii thought they were about to be bombed. They thought they were going to die, and it took, like I said, 38 minutes for them to compile a response to remind everybody this was a mistake, that in fact everything is going to be okay. And what I want to try and suggest is that this is a bit of a precursor perhaps for something that was about to happen throughout 2020 and 2021, that a series of mass emotional events triggered globally and experienced simultaneously as entire nations and even continents. So the COVID-19 pandemic has caused sudden and dramatic shifts in social interaction that warrants a reimagining of emotional contagions. The collective hopes and anxieties of those living through the pandemic indicate the development of a new normal that highlights the need to reconsider some existing theories. In particular, the rapid change in collective emotions, spreading in an almost viral manner that warrants that we pay new attention to existing concepts. So the idea that emotions are created and shared collectively, of course, is not new. The spread of feelings to create common collective emotional experiences and cultures is captured in existing theories of emotional contagion from people like von Schieve and Isner. And this is emerging from early theories of crowd behavior from people like Gustave Le Bon, who suggest that emotions spread physically at the microsocial level through a process of mimicking, synchronizing expressions, vocalization, postures, and movements, and that this creates a feedback loop that homogenizes into kind of recognizable emotion shared by a group of people. And we see this in, for example, the social psychology of Hatfield in the mid-90s. More recent studies have found this micro-level phenomenon can occur online between individuals interacting through bounded social media networks. However, recent events demonstrate the power of macro events to influence and spread emotions widely across whole societies and nations. And COVID-19 has resulted in new attention, focus, and emotional balance being given to rolling government press releases and the 24-hour news cycle. And this is amplified and hastened to some extent by social media. So in this new emotional landscape, singular examples of emotional contagions, so for example, panic buying toilet paper, or sort of collective anxiety over school closures, are experienced, we argue, by millions of people simultaneously. And this represents something kind of fundamentally different to how we've previously talked about emotional contagion. So we are offering this idea of a mass emotional event in order to describe how the impacts of emotional contagion can accumulate across the micro, meso, and macro, and take particular forms at the national and even international level. So existing theories of emotion of collective emotion, depend on some form of emotional contagion that spreads between physically interacting individuals or through shared cultural representations. The former sort of emotional contagion literature is particularly well developed in psychology and social psychology. I mentioned before Hatfield's work from the mid-90s, who target sort of much of their groundbreaking book on emotional contagions through this idea of the sort of primitive emotional contagion, which they described, and this is a quote, as relatively automatic, unintentional, and controllable, and largely inaccessible to conversant awareness. More recent definitions have considered the transfer of emotions from person to person within, say, workplaces, but also crowds. Now, the relevance of a sort of pre-intentional emotional stimulus within interactions remains key in this literature. But more recently, we've started to see that emotional contagions can also exist in virtual and online spaces. So the Facebook emotional contagion experiment from 2012 was a clear example of the transfer of emotions between users and social media, as well as the potential for social media platforms to wield the power to drive mass emotional manipulations. Now, the controversial findings published by Kramer et al. In 2014 suggest that when manipulating users' feeds on Facebook with more or less positive or negative content, the posts produced under that manipulation matched the collective mood of their feed. Now, flooding a user's feed with negative content, as it turns out, will lead to users posting more negative content themselves, and the same is true for positive content. Now, the findings clearly show that emotional contagions do not need to be face-to-face or verbal, but can function through a variety of forms of communication. And furthermore, emotional contagions can result in emotional experiences that are intentional, reflexive, ironic, sarcastic, and so on. Now, Stiglitz and Danjwan's analysis of Twitter posts suggests that emotionally charged tweets on average were retweeted more than tweets with more neutral language. And in addition, this kind of indicates that social media spaces have emotional intensities that users access and reproduce in virtual exchanges. Finally, Steinert just last year picks up on this trend and highlights that the COVID-19 pandemic can be linked to increased social media usage, as well as an increase in the volume of emotional content in users' posts. And this includes preliminary data from a variety of social media platforms that indicate increased levels of fear, sadness, anxiety, and so on during the COVID-19 pandemic. Other examples of this kind of response on social media platforms can be found following natural disasters and terrorist attacks, but we feel that the COVID-19 pandemic offers a much more dramatic picture of emotional contagions online due to the prominence of social media this year and last year, and the increased usage during periods of self-isolation. So what are we offering in response to this? The recent COVID-19 pandemic warrants, we argue, a development of a broadened understanding of emotional contagions and collective emotions to incorporate this idea of a mass emotional event. The fundamental differences between mass emotional events and hitherto examples of emotional contagions are as follows. First, the potential for the increased scale in a mass emotional event. Second, the spread of emotional contagion from non-human sources and in non-reciprocal ways. And finally, that the catalyst of the event can be something that participants may have no direct contact with, but regardless have a profound effect on their lives. And in the chapter, we talk about 9/11 as an example of this, especially as someone in Australia, that there may be very little direct impact. But we can also think about COVID in this sense, in that there are still parts of Australia that are largely unaffected. Now, von Schief's depiction of collective emotions is widely relevant and useful in a sociological understanding of emotion, but his work remains largely based on face-to-face and crowd interactions. Even when his theory is expanded to consider macro phenomenon through contributions of people like Randall Collins and Emil Durkheim, it remains limited, I think, by a core focus on psychological and physiological exchanges between interacting individuals. And this allows for physical proximity and a widely shared appraisal structure within existing communities, as he writes. But it is limited in scope in the context of the enormity of an event like COVID-19. That mass emotional events, in contrast, transcend group-based emotions and allow for an analysis of shared emotions on both a micro, meso, and macro scale. So the dissemination of emotional contagions defies traditional understandings of shared emotions within groups to include the spread of emotional information across social, economic, and geographical borders. An enduring consequence of this new format is the lack of emotional reciprocation between individuals and the source of the emotional stimulus. As a result, despite the increased use of social media platforms during the pandemic, large numbers of individuals participate kind of together alone in the event of the crisis. That mass emotional events possess unique and often chaotic forms of emotional energy that contrast sharply with the more traditional moral focus of emotional contagions. Widespread transmission of emotional catalysts results in displaced feelings that lack a singular focus for people to direct emotions towards. And in the case of COVID-19, there's no clear resolution, no hero, no enemy, although there are certainly public scapegoats. This leads to a diffused and ambivalent emotional energy that defies description and definition, and can feel passive and active, targeted and directionless, angry and elated all at once. While traditional emotional contagions spread bit by bit, In a mass emotional event, individuals are affected by the stimulus synchronously as the contagion permeates all interactions and leaps rapidly through news and social media. While this could result in heightened levels of collective emotions, it can also lead to individuals processing aspects of the emotional contagion in greater isolation, while the broader community is fragmented by a lack of organic interactional exchanges. Although some have associated collective emotions and emotion contagions with an intellectual return to, say, Durkheim's collective effervescence, mass emotional events suggest the possibility of a contagion in the absence of contact and offer a renewed risk of anomie and emotional disconnection. So it's important to note that more encompassing characteristics of a mass emotional event do not flatten out existing demographic differences and inequalities. Demographic differences based in age, sexuality, race, class, gender, and education remain mediating conditions for the impact of a mass emotional event like the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet it's important to recognize that these phenomena are not limited to in-group transmissions, as has previously been the case with collective emotions. In contrast to traditional understandings of emotional contagions, a mass emotional event is capable of creating irreversible cultural shifts that transcend demographic or subcultural groupings. At this point, I'll hand over to my co-presenter, Roger.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. Would you mind continuing to shift the slides? You can jump to the next one. Thanks. So Jordan, I think, has summed up neatly the idea that we're trying to get at here, this idea of a potentially permanent and deep and fundamental change in how we feel in the wake of these enormous events like we've just experienced with COVID. And then a fundamental question becomes, well, what is the long-term impact of this mass emotional event? How does it change, or how has it changed how we collectively feel now and potentially into the far future? And I just wanted to raise some considerations and possibilities. One is that we may see the beginnings of different emotions. So rapidly changing emotions might have reached a point of critical mass where emotional climates and cultures become permanently altered and different emotions predominate, like, for example, fear, anger, hope, and there's all sorts of literatures around those.
Just 3 minutes.
Thank you. Another point is there can be a continuation of pre-existing emotional climates. In other words, COVID may not have actually changed the emotional climates much at all, but simply perhaps channeled them, muted them, exaggerated or accelerated the pre-existing emotional states. For example, we can think about the concerns that have been around for a long time about risk society with Beck, the anxiety over climate change, my own personal interest in studying loneliness. It was an important topic before COVID hit. COVID may have accelerated things. Another issue is the rise of a different kind of emotional state, almost a fusion of different pre-existing emotions into something new or different or muted. For example, an ambivalent or blasé kind of feeling, which can link to the works of Burkett or going further back, Zimmel. Could you change the slide? And another important issue is this movement from emotional management at the individual level to a kind of a mass emotional management, where we've almost never been so focused on the mental health of our citizenry as we are now. And we're in a state of this big flux and change in collective emotions, but also we're very, very interested in the management of those collective emotions. So you consider what we've seen in terms of the mass management of public panic and fear, but also the mass management of people becoming too relaxed and too complacent. So in other words, you want a kind of Goldilocks zone somewhere in the middle, being not too afraid, but also at least a little bit afraid. Then there's the mass digital mediation of emotions, also accelerating all the time, but hugely with COVID, and whole new feelings associated with that. For example, Zoom anxiety, too much time on Zoom. And very importantly, new emotional inequalities. This changing emotional landscape can shift who feels what, who is impacted badly, and also who's forced to manage more so. Can you jump to the last slide, please? And so I just want to quickly say, where lies our capacity for hope in all of this? Well, it's in our capacity to understand, try and examine and understand which emotions now predominate, which are continuing and emerging, how people find meaning in these new emotional forms, how people enact agency, and how governments can take sometimes punitive action in managing emotions, and the long-term consequences of the shift to digital interaction. And also in our attempts to try and redress problematic or debilitating mass emotional states, and enhance and engage with socially positive emotional states, which doesn't always mean socially positive emotions, just those states, and redress emerging inequalities in emotions. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And apologies, Roger, for not introducing you as well as one of the speakers. I missed that on the program. So just seeing if we have any hands up or questions in the chat. Sometimes it takes people a little second to think. I might ask, I guess there's the emphasis on the emotional contagion and the mass and the kind of COVID context, but I was wondering where the event kind of sits in terms of, are you drawing on like a different concepts around event thinking, or is that important to this concept?
Jordan, you want to answer?
I don't know. That's not something we've kind of put that much thought into. I mean, I think this idea of simultaneous notifications, this idea that I know in Victoria it's a bit different, but in New South Wales there's been this tradition of it's 11 o'clock. How many cases are there? Everybody looks at their phone at the same time, and I've had a lot of classrooms, for example, like Zoom teaching, where the class in the middle of the class it kind of stops and everybody stops what they're doing. How many cases do we have today? It's like it takes everybody a minute to look at the data before they can come back to class. I mean, it's these kinds of things that I'm really interested in, and there's something very unnatural about that compared to the sort of historical versions of emotional contagion, which are, of course, have been around for a very, very long time, and are certainly not something radically new. And so I do think there is kind of something interesting in terms of that source of emotional impact.
Yeah, and I'd add to that there's a sense of the event being huge and disruptive, and the impact of it is large. Jordan identified a number of aspects to this, about how an event can be so big that it can impact somebody on the other side of the planet, when in fact it might not have much to do with their everyday life, but they're very aware of it, and the consequences will flow through to how they feel. So 9/11 was one sort of example, but COVID is such a hugely changing event. It's different from a classic emotional contagion, which will normally lead off some sort of, or quite often lead off some sort of moral panic or, moral dilemma or something along those lines. Yeah.
Thanks. Jazz has a hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question about the hierarchies of emotions in those kind of mass events. And I'm in Melbourne right now, so one thing that springs to mind immediately, just because we've been through such a prolonged lockdown, is the very clear binaries that are often delineated on Twitter between the pro-Dan brigade and dictator Dan brigade, and there is no nuance, and any kind of discussion of, well, okay, lockdown is needed, but do we need such heavy policing, is kind of immediately thrown into the binary of anti-lockdown. And the privileging of saving all lives at the cost of everything else. We'll talk about mental health later. We'll talk about all that stuff of people losing jobs later. We've lost a lot of nuance in this mass, I think rightly so, emotional event. And I was wondering if you had any comment on the sort of hierarchies that were produced and continue to be produced during the pandemic.
May I respond just for a sec? So you notice that in the end of the presentation, I talked about some possibilities, and some of them included whole new emotions arising to sort of become great explanators, or put forward as great explanators, but others were about continuing emotions from pre-existing events that just got magnified during COVID. So I think that's really relevant to, I'm assuming, that the type of Twitter space you're talking about, where you've got on one side probably sort of progressive voices, and the other side more conservative voices. So you got a magnifying pre-existing emotional states there, which I'm assuming, there's a lot of anger, fear, upset, but also potentially hope that your side will prevail. And then that gets churned through the lens of COVID and gets this extra boost and gets magnified and turned into something huge. But then added to that, you got the fear of COVID itself, which will muddy the waters and change that around a little bit. I guess the answer is there's no real answer, but it's just it's a space where there's a lot of at play at the moment, a lot of flux, and absolutely politics and the pre-pandemic politics plays into it, but it's shifting really rapidly, and I'm very curious to see what it's like when all the borders are open again, and what happens in Twitter there. Will it all fade away or not?
If I can just say something very quickly, is that okay?
Very quickly.
Very, very quickly. I actually think that part of the mass emotional event concept for me is this idea that despite the kind of black and white separation that we see in Twitter, the sort of Twitterverse, is that actually there's a great deal of ambivalence in the community in terms of how we react to things like making a calculation about vaccination risk, or making a calculation around socializing and whether I should go to the cinema and those sorts of things. That actually, I think ambivalence and this kind of sort of messy emotions are actually probably the far more common in the non-Twitter space, despite the fact that on Twitter everything does seem to be so polarized.
Thank you.
Great, thank you everyone, and thank you Jordan and Roger.